Hi everyone, this is Dre from Dragon Consulting. If you're new to my channel, then welcome, and if you've been with me for some previous videos, welcome back. So today I want to talk to you about workarounds. We had a video last time about what some of the reasons are for people creating workarounds, and today I want to talk about what some of the impacts are when workarounds are in place. So just to refresh on the introduction, or if you're new to joining me this week, a workaround is an alternative path to accomplishing a task or series of tasks that is in some way different from the process that was designed or intended. So from an impact perspective, what we see with workarounds is that downstream impacts or impacts that are subsequent to the action are often not well understood by the individual that performed those workaround tasks. And in a lot of cases, the impacts can be experienced by individuals in a different area, in a different time, or those with a different role. So we've got 5 main areas of impact that I'd like to talk about, and you'll see them listed here on your screen. And I'll dive right in and chat a little bit more about them. So first and foremost, I want to talk about frustration. So when workarounds are in place, there's often a lot of frustration that follows. So frustration can be felt by the individuals that are actually performing the workaround in the first place. And that can be because the workaround is not something that they desire to do. So if there's a system issue where something is broken or things aren't functioning the way they wanted and they're forced to put a workaround in place, this can be something that just becomes quite onerous for them to do and isn't desired. So frustration can occur in that instance. Frustration can actually occur for other end users. So when workarounds are put in place to try to improve efficiency or to just follow a different path or take an alternate route, if users that are also in the system aren't aware that things are being done that way, then they can have some frustrating moments where they assume the tasks aren't complete. So they're looking for things in a certain spot, or they're expecting a specific sequence to occur, and if that doesn't happen, they may incorrectly jump to the conclusion that something wasn't done. So the other component that leads to frustration is future process design. So if workarounds are in place, even if the people that are actually performing them at the time are well aware and that's been communicated, if people who are designing future processes or subsequent steps in the path aren't aware that there's been a change or something different is occurring, then they're not actually going to design the new subsequent steps in an efficient manner. So they're going to misalign and it's going to cause frustrations because it's going to seem like it's not flowing properly. So that can be quite frustrating. And finally, I'll mention cultural challenges. So, and this, relates to the future process design and those who are creating things. If workarounds are in place and not everyone is aware that they're occurring, or not everyone is aware of how things are being documented, there can often be, a situation of, an us versus them type of approach, or a misunderstanding between different groups or different roles, and often between clinical staff and IT. So clinical staff feel that IT maybe doesn't understand what they need to do or should be doing, and they've designed a process that doesn't work for them. And the IT staff on the other side may feel frustrated and misunderstood because, they've created something that they believe met the requirements, and lo and behold, everyone's doing something differently and they don't understand why. So this can cause frustration across the board. So the second one that I'll mention is difficulty locating information. So the impact that this has is actually sometimes not good. So end users are expecting information to be in a certain spot, or it to be done in a certain way where they can find it fairly rapidly, sort of along the path. And if a workaround causes that information to be done differently or skips steps or things like that, then it may take longer to locate the documentation. So that adds time to someone that's looking for it. The other thing that might happen is if it's not where they're expecting to find it, and it's taking a while to sort of look through things, there is a risk of them missing that altogether, which is definitely not something that we want to have happen, and not something that the person doing the workaround ever would have intended. So with IT systems, Added to this risk of missing information, we also have a risk of it not being incorporated into sort of the desired path in the system. So an example that I'll give you of this to explain this a little better is for point of care test results. If point of care test results are entered at the bedside as a free text comment on certain screens or in flow sheets or certain areas, and they're not actually entered in the fields or the areas that they should be entered in, so if they're strung together in free text, for example, then they can't be included in trending, and they're not actually going to show up in the correct places. So this presents them not being incorporated into other areas. So the third one would be downstream triggers. So applications that are created for use in the healthcare environment are designed and set up with a particular flow and sequence in mind. So there is a pathway that should be followed in order for something to, end to end be designed and meet the requirements and regulatory rules that were put in place. So if a workaround is in place, there can be impacts that sort of happen to this actually along the way. So the impacts can be to clinical decision support or the suggestions and help that the system is providing. Those are actually configured with specific logic points and data points, and the system needs to pull those from spots it's expecting to find them. And if there's workarounds in place and the data is not presented where it is set up to do so for decision support, it's not actually going to pull it in, and that's not going to function correctly. So along those same lines, reports and dashboards are also looking for data elements in certain spots. And if a workaround is in place and that data is being put somewhere else, then the report or dashboard may not be able to pull it in, or may only be able to pull in a portion of the data. So you can see gaps or incorrect in complete information in reports and dashboards. So finally, in the downstream triggers, if the information that is being captured is meant to transmit to another system, so if you have specific information in an order item, for example, that should be transmitting over to a lab system, or you have document details that are sent over to Health Information Exchange, if the information is put in a different spot, it may not flow through those interfaces correctly. So it may truncate information, it may drop it off, or it may not be able to pick it up in the first place. So the fourth impact that I'll mention is an impact to future changes. So if you have a workaround in place, and it's something that's not sort of understood or not well communicated across the entire organization, any changes that are subsequent to that or anything that happens in the future become quite difficult to communicate in a comprehensive way. So when changes are done to an IT system or to a process in general, the best way to communicate a change is to let people know what is different from what they are doing now. So, what will the new process be and how does it differ from what I'm doing today? If the individuals that are creating those communications aren't aware of what's being done today or don't have the exact detail on what's being done today, it becomes very difficult to communicate to the end user community what they need to do differently, and the messages seem like they make no sense. So the other thing with future changes is testing efforts that are going on for those changes may not be inclusive of all the workarounds. So again, if everyone's not aware that a workaround's in place or that something is being done, then it's difficult to incorporate it into your testing plans. And it actually can lead to issues where you have additional issues that come out as a result. You don't have the ability to test them because you didn't know they were happening. Therefore, you couldn't find issues before they were sent to the production environment. And the risk of not addressing issues and workarounds actually can compound over time. So each of these things can be a single event where a single change can sort of discover it along the way. But if workarounds are in place and perpetuated, or several workarounds are in place, then you actually you have a risk of not addressing issues that just continues to sort of compound the workaround situation. So the last one I'll mention is training. So I did mention that communication with change management is an impact in certain situations. And training is actually another one that follows along that same line of thinking. So efforts to train new users will start to become anecdotal. So you don't have the ability to actually incorporate detailed scenarios or to describe process paths that would match what everyone's doing in the real world if the individuals that are creating the content and creating those scenarios are not aware that there's actual workarounds in place. So they're going to actually document and create training materials based on what the designed and intended path was, and not what the multitude of paths are that workarounds actually have demonstrated. So that can be quite problematic over time. So the other thing that leads to, in the same way it would lead to issues with training end users, is challenges in training support staff. So in the healthcare environment, one of the things that is very, very important is we'd like to have healthcare contextual components taught to our IT staff when they're providing support. So they actually can understand the impacts in relevant terms, that they know the importance of things, that they know how critical some things can be if they didn't think of it in another area. And it's difficult to train people on how the system's being used and how the system should be supported if we're not sure of workarounds that are in place. So workflow can also be different for some areas or roles or individuals. So if not everybody is performing the workaround and you've only got certain areas or pockets of people that are doing that, it can become quite difficult for support staff to understand sort of who's doing what, when, and where. And keeping them up to date and trained on that is quite challenging and is an impact that a lot of people don't think about. So in conclusion, for this one, there's a lot of impacts along the way that we maybe hadn't thought about when it comes to workarounds. Not all of them are going to be there for every workaround that's in place. But even if a couple of them are, it's maybe not great. So one of the things that I'd like to encourage is if there are workarounds that are discovered, or if a workaround is being considered in the area that you're in, it's important to communicate to the appropriate individuals. So this can include, representative from appropriate clinical departments. So some of the transition departments that you're going to interact with or your patients are going to transfer to or from. IT, as well as leadership groups, so that everybody can be on the same page and that so all the impacts or potential impacts can be identified and remedied or mitigated before that actually needs to happen. So if we hesitate in doing that, we can have some longer term impacts that we're not going to love. And over time, they can compound, becoming increasingly difficult to manage. So it's very important that we keep the lines of communications open. And as I mentioned in the last post, not all workarounds are bad. And some of them are actually beneficial. And if that's the case, communication there is great too, because we want to make sure that we can get those out to everybody. So I've got one more on workarounds that I'll talk about in the next video. And if you'd like to get notified when that comes out, just hit the subscribe button and you can have that on your YouTube channel, or keep checking back with me. So thanks again for joining me, and I will talk to you soon.